Almaty is such an exceptional city. Like I said, the first day I woke up and I saw the mountains, and it was gorgeous. And there's so much right around Almaty to be explored. And if you love hiking or doing anything like that, it's just a wonderful place to go. My first trip to Kazakhstan, I believe, was in 2013. I traveled in the summer that year. I enrolled at Kazakh Abai University and took Kazakh courses. But boy, the next day when I woke up and I saw the mountains and I got to explore the city a bit, I just fell in love. And, it's such a great city and the people are so amazing. I think, the thing that really fascinated me about this topic when I first got into it was just sort of the totality of what horses represented in Kazakh history and culture and society, even economically, how important they were. And Kazakhstan in particular, it's many people argue that it's in modern day northern Kazakhstan with the bow tie people, where horses were first domesticated. And so anywhere in the world, Kazakhstan really has this special connection and special history with horses in all walks of life. When you travel to Kazakhstan, even today, kumis, mare's milk, is still sort of a popular drink. And, Kazakhstan is where horse meat is still considered a delicacy. And actually, right around the time I started my project, the London Olympics were being held, and Kazakh Olympians had to get special permission in order to bring kaza, horse meat sausage, with them to London, because they said that it would, keep them fit and strong and help them perform to the best of their abilities. And so there's really still this this health benefit idea behind horse meat and kumis and all things related to the horse. Within Kazakh culture, horses are sort of present in ceremonies and rites to this day, from birth sometimes to marriage ceremonies, even death, funeral ceremonies. Young boys are put on horses at early ages and taught to ride and expected to ride sometimes. And so it like I said, it really still is pervasive in society. And from a state perspective, what's really interesting is the way that in the post-Soviet period, the state has tried to kind of latch on to some of these symbols from the Kazakh past and push them as sort of a unifying symbol. And so horses are, if you go look at the Monument to Independence in Almaty, the main statue is flanked by two smaller statues with young boys on horseback. And in the state emblem, you see two mythic winged horses called tulpar, and so it's still very ever present and something that Kazakhs are proud of, and this connection with the horses. With my research too, studying kind of the Slavic migration aspect of it, horses were incredibly important to settlers as well. There are some great letters that I read from Russian peasants who were moving eastward, and they went on and on about how great Siberia and Central Asia and the steppe was going to be when they got there. One letter writer said that even the poor have 40 horses when you get there, right? And so another letter writer, I was just looking at some notes, he wrote back home talking about how things were going in his new homestead. And he said, well, I don't have a house yet. It's not built, but I have land and I have good horses. And so, these are the things that really, during my research jumped out to me and really kind of made me smile. But what's interesting is that as kind of settlers made their way, you started to see some of these settlers adopting the Kazakh ways of life, because they would get there. And, the thing that maybe they didn't think about was that Kazakhs didn't just practice mobile pastoralism for the fun of it, right? They have centuries of practice doing this, and they knew the land and they knew the environment, and they adapted to it as best they could. So important about that area was where it was geographically, and going back to the Silk Road period, Central Asia was a very important kind of crossroads east and west, and you can see the spread of this culture from east to west into the Caucasus and Turkey and even parts of North Africa. And as the Russian state moved in, there's kind of this question of whether or not this lifestyle could be maintained. And this is something that I never really grappled with too much, but there's some amazing works by, I think of Carolyn Humphrey and David Sneath have a work called The End of Nomadism, ? And they sort of key in on some of these mobile pastoralist societies in Russia, in sort of Asia, and they kind of draw the conclusion that mobile pastoralism could be compatible with modernity, opposed to maybe what the Soviet state or the Russian state said. And what's interesting here too is not only were Slavic settlers adopting some of the practices that Kazakhs utilized, but also in the 1920s, you see the Soviet state almost pushing for a change in the way that horse breeders were raising and breeding horses, and saying that, boy, the way that the old Kazakhs used to do it in the herds, it produced stronger horses, better horses, and it was actually easier on the land than kind of creating these large sort of industrial, breeding centers. In my work, one of the more fascinating and one of the more fun aspects that I worked on was on horse theft in Kazakhstan, because like I sort of pointed to earlier, growing up and learning about settlers moving west in the United States, horse theft was always sort of at the forefront of society out there, and horse thieves were always sort of the worst of the worst, because horses were so important. And it was really interesting to see that same dynamic, although, I guess I should have expected it. It was interesting to see that same dynamic playing out in Kazakhstan. Horse thieves, were routinely the worst of the worst. And sort of the punishments that horse thieves got were terrible, right? And so that sort of points to how important the horses were. But an interesting dynamic was just how both of these societies, right, the settlers on one hand and the Kazakhs on the other, how they sort of blamed one another for for horse theft, and it was something that that the authorities really wanted to get control over, because they called it, one of the worst. It was one of the worst crimes. And one of a story that I recall was that settlers said that it was almost impossible to catch Kazakh horse thieves, because they would either take the horses and run off to the steppe where they could never be found, or oftentimes they would just eat the horse, right? Kind of pointing to this, thinking that, I don't know if it was, bad or something, that Russians didn't quite eat as much horse as Kazakhs did, but this was sort of this cultural animosity, perhaps. And so one of the things that we see happening, though, was as settlers began to move to the steppe and kind of push Kazakh herders off of their seasonal grazing routes, some of these Kazakhs with smaller herds, they couldn't keep up. And so I write about these sort of rich herders called Abais. And these Abais, sometimes their herds were thousands of horses large. And what would happen is these smaller herders, they would sort of be just kind of incorporated into these larger, the Abais would kind of, would just kind of pull their herds in, because they were getting pushed off their land. But Abais sort of had the clout to be able to maintain a lot of their herding, their seasonal routes. And so in, Soviet history in particular, they like to look at the Russian imperial past and really kind of blame this on the Russians, which, there is some truth there. These poor these smaller herders were pulled into big herds, and they were forced to work for these Abais. And so it sort of created this wealth gap, I guess, where the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. And the Soviets, during the time of collectivization, that was one of the groups of people that they really keyed on, were the kulaks. And in Kazakhstan, the Abais. The Abais were thrown right in with the kulaks. And so there was, just like we saw with kulaks in the rest of Russia, there was sort of these people would be quick to denounce them and say, they're the ones that are rich and they own all these horses. And so really society, Kazakh society really changed in that manner too. Kishkintai. Because one of the problems that I found was that I learned Kazakh, or I was learning Kazakh, but then when I got to the archives, all of the documents that I needed to read, they were all in Russian, right? Because of, Kazakhs didn't have quite as much written information as the Russian state. Obviously, the Russian state, all of their documents obviously were in Russian, and so I started to lose Kazakh a little bit. But what was really interesting between my first time in Almaty and the second time, so I was there in 2013, and then when I returned in 2017, I noticed that there was a lot more people speaking Kazakh in Almaty than the first time, it seemed. And I had always heard that if you traveled outside of Almaty, Kazakh was spoken much more than Russian, but in Almaty, in the big city, Russian was kind of the lingua franca of the city. And so it was really interesting to see more people speaking Kazakh, and now, almost on 30 years of independence, Kazakhstan is pushing for sort of a Latin alphabet, and they want to push this trilingualism with Kazakh and English, and it seems maybe Russian sort of last in that. But and so it's nice to see that. I wish that I could have. I wish that I would have. Maybe not that I could have. I wish that I would have spoken Kazakh more and really learned it to a much better degree.